After Les Paul died, his children opened his secret. They had no idea what they were seeing. They cried when they saw the huge amount of money inside. Rock guitars worth $1 million, patents worth $1 million, and royalty checks that never stopped coming. But that was only the start. From family fights to auctions that broke records, this is the crazy story of how a $5 deal turned into one of the biggest music fortunes ever. On June 9th, Les Paul was born as Lester William Pulsfuss. 1915 in Waukesha, Wisconsin. The people in his family were German. Evelyn, his mother, had ties to the brewing business in Milwaukee and the Stutz Car Company. George, his father, ran a garage where Lester spent a lot of time getting extra parts. He was the kind of kid who saw the good in everything. Their wooden staircase was even used as a test subject. He cut the steps down to change their pitch, which made them sound like a musical instrument. His mother thought it was smart, but she didn't like how it hurt him. Evelyn changed his parents' last name from Pulsfuss to Pulfuss when they got a divorce. During World War I, there was a lot of hate against Germany, and she wanted to make things better. Lester never officially changed his name to Les Paul, but he began using it after a while. As early as age 5, he was already putting on shows. When the Rotary Club met, he stood on tables and sang, "How are you going to keep him down on the farm?" His mother was told by a music teacher, "Your son will never learn music." He wasn't stopped. He took a harmonica apart when he was 8 years old just to see how it worked. He then put it back together and learned how to play by himself. He made his first radio when he was 9 years old. It didn't need power. Through a wire he put between trees, it pulled sound straight from the air. At age 10, he wanted to play both the guitar and the harp at the same time. He made a hands-free harp holder because of this, adding pieces of wood and bent wire to make it work. He kept making changes until it did. His brother worked at a dry cleaner and brought extra hangers home. Les made a lot of prototypes out of them, trying and making them better with each one. He was playing the guitar at a drive-in restaurant in 1925 when someone in the crowd said, "Red, your guitar isn't loud enough." That was all he needed to push himself. He took the mouthpiece off of his mom's phone and hooked it up to a radio speaker. He yelled in the mouthpiece while holding it to a broomstick to make it sound louder. Enough. He put a phonograph needle in the guitar's bridge and connected it to the radio speaker. The sound was rough and bounced around a lot, but it worked in some way. He had just made the first step toward making the electric guitar when he was 12 years old. Some people didn't believe him, but he kept going. When he was 13, he played roadhouses under the name Red Hot Red. At that time, $5 a night was a lot of money, and he was making it by playing music. When he was 15, he made up 2 different stage names. He played country music on the St. Louis radio while Rhubarb Red. He played jazz in Chicago bars as Les Paul. He went back and forth between the two based on the crowd, trying new things all the time and looking for something new. He quit school when he was 17 to go on tour. He first played with Rube Tronson's Texas Cowboys and then switched to Sonny Joe Wolverton's band. He had his big moment at Beekman's Barbecue when he got home. A tin bucket was sitting next to him while he played the guitar for tips. He made $14 some nights, which was enough to buy more radio parts. He never thought of music and invention as 2 different things. They worked together for him. Things began to go smoothly after Paul moved to Chicago in 1934. The Chicago World's Fair, where he played, was so big that he had never played in front of so many people before. He also got radio jobs that would shape his future at the same time. Paul was right in the middle of all the music going on in Chicago, beginning to host shows on WBBM in Chicago and WRGN in Racine with Sonny Joe Wolverton by his side. During the day, he played country music as Rhubarb Red for people in the Midwest who lived in rural areas. But at night, everything changed for him. He started playing jazz and tried out new styles. This helped him learn how to lead an audience in a new way. These changes from country to jazz weren't just about how they were played. He wasn't just becoming a musician. They were making him into something else. Along with his time on the radio and in bars in Chicago, he met some of the best musicians of all time. He met Art Tatum, a musician whose fingers moved so quickly it was hard to tell if they were real. Tatum taught Paul how to approach music in a way he had never thought of before by teaching him complicated chords and improvisation. And then there was Django Reinhardt, a musician who played so well even though he had lost 2 fingers in a fire. Reinhardt made new style instead of seeing it as a problem that no one had ever heard before. Paul paid attention, learned, and watched. He didn't just like these artists, he played with them. Every night, he jammed with the best musicians in Chicago and picked up tricks and ideas that he later used in his own way. Those days were over when he was only a country or jazz artist. He was new and something in between. But what he learned most was how to come up with new ideas. What Tatum and Reinhardt taught him about music was more than just how to play well. It was about doing things that other people thought were impossible. In 1953, years after the fact, Paul showed how much Reinhardt had affected him. Many people in the music world were shocked when Reinhardt died suddenly at age 43. Paul's life was changed by him, and he never forgot what he had taught him. A quiet thing he did that not many people knew about was that he helped pay for Reinhardt's funeral. It was never Les Paul's goal to change music. He just wanted his guitar to sound better. Back in the 1930s, it was hard to play in big halls because acoustic guitars weren't made for that size of room. They couldn't be heard over a full band, even with mics. He did everything he could to fix it. In order to stop the guitar from vibrating too much, he filled the body with clothes, wood, and even plaster of Paris. But none of it worked. The feedback didn't go away, even though his guitar got louder. He lost it one night in a small club in Wisconsin. He tried to boost the sound by connecting a turntable needle to his guitar. It was only a quick fix. He needed a real answer. Then it hit him. It wasn't just the microphones or the amps that were broken. It was the guitar itself. He began to see it clearly by the late 1930s. It was the guitar's hollow body that did it. Everything that moved was increased, not just the music. The whole instrument became an echo chamber of noise. Getting rid of the hollow body was the only way to get clean, controlled sound. He built something that no one had ever seen before in 1941. It was called the log. The name says it all. It's just a 4x4 piece of wood with a guitar neck and pickups connected to it. He put the sides of an old Epiphone hollow body on it with bolts to make it look less weird. But they were only there to look good. The strong wood heart gave it its power. There are no more echoes or unwanted vibrations. There's only clean, endless sustain. Les Paul went to Los Angeles in 1943, which changed the course of music history. Paul turned the garage of his Hollywood home into a creative place that wasn't like anything else at the time after Bing Crosby told him to open a recording studio. The space wasn't just a room full of tools. For him, it was a place where sound could go further. He made his own tools for recording, and he even used a Cadillac flywheel as a homemade lathe for recording. He wanted something different. It was something no one had ever heard before. Over the next 2 years, he played around with different ways to add sounds, such as overdubbing, sound-on-sound recording, and changing the speed. He got closer to what he called the new sound with each new sound he found. Musicians started coming to his studio because of his experiments and the way he could make regular records sound bigger, fuller, and more alive. Paul did more than just play music. He shaped it. Acetate discs were used to record one layer of sound, then played it back while adding another. He kept doing it over and over until the music was just right for him. It was hard. It took hundreds of tries for some songs to sound great. His song Lover shocked people in 1948. The Business. It had 8 levels of guitar, and he played all of them. The sound was different from everything else. Columbia Records turned it down because they didn't know what to do with it. But Capitol Records saw the idea, and the song was a big hit when it came out. Paul didn't just make songs in his garage. He did other things too. It was his idea to change how music was made. His methods laid the groundwork for multi-track recording, which quickly became the norm in the business. While he was making a name for himself as an innovator and artist, he made the song It's Been a Long, Long Time with Bing Crosby in 1945. People were getting back together with their loved ones after being apart for years because of the war. That feeling was nicely summed up in the song. Paul's piano playing was soft and warm, and it gave Crosby's singing more depth, which made it shine even more. Before the song even came out, it was already at the top of the Billboard charts. It stayed there for weeks. Not only as a singer, but also as a leader, Crosby saw something special in Paul. He gave Paul an Ampex Model 200, a reel-to-reel tape player, in 1948. It was one of the first machines of its kind that could be bought in stores. Paul took it apart right away and put it back together again, this time adding an extra playback head so he could record more than one track without losing the ones that were already there. This wasn't just one more test. It was a big step forward that would change music for good. After everything looked like it was going to plan, bad things happened. As Paul drove through Oklahoma on January 13th, 1948, an ice storm made the road as smooth as glass. His car slid and then hit something. His wrist and right arm were broken. The doctors told him they had to cut off his limb. There was no worse news for a musician than that, but Paul wouldn't listen. Instead, he persuaded the doctors to leave his arm at an angle for good, one that would let him keep playing. Even though it hurt, there was no doubt about the decision. He wasn't going to give up music because it was his life. It took more than a year to get better. He could think but not play. While lying in a hospital bed, he thought of new songs to record. He had been playing around with multi-track methods before, but now he had time to make them better in his mind before he used them in real life. After that, there was a Mary Ford. She had a voice that could make any melody sound unique because she grew up in a musical home. In 1945, country star Gene Autry put her in touch with famous guitarist Les Paul. Les liked her as a singer, but he also thought she would be great for his creative ideas. After working together for a while, their relationship grew into something more. They got married in 1949. Now, their personal and professional lives were totally linked. They were one of the biggest bands in music in the early 1950s. Hit records. It was all about songs like How High the Moon and Vaya con Dios, which stayed at #1 for weeks. They sold 6 million songs just in 1951. At that time, no one else had a sound like theirs. Les did a lot more than play guitar. He added to it, changed it, and made it sound almost like an orchestra. Mary's voice was more than just a tune. There were more of them. They all worked together, and they were made into something bigger than one person could ever sing live. It wasn't just skill that made their sound great. Technology was to blame. In order to push the boundaries of what music could be, Les Paul was always trying new things. He played as fast as a tape, adding new sounds and overdubbing that had never been done before. He didn't record in big studios. Instead, he brought the gear into their home and used garages and hotel rooms as makeshift recording places. He put microphones close to Mary's mouth, which made her speech sound warm and personal. They lived in New Jersey, and he carved an echo chamber right into the rock below their house. They paid close attention to every detail so that their music sounded bigger, more advanced than anything else on the radio. They had an effect outside of the studio as well. In 1953, they played their music on TV live with Les Paul and Mary Ford, a 5-minute show that came on 5 times a week. It wasn't just a show, it was a look into their lives with footage of them playing music at home. People who saw them felt like they were right there with them, watching two people who were partners in real life as well as on stage. It was one of the first types of reality TV, even though no one knew what it was called at the time. But the Les Paul V-Riser might have been the most amazing thing Les Paul ever made. He wanted to record their live shows, so he made a machine that let him play on stage and play along with pre-recorded songs. That made it look like they had a full band with them. Even though there were only 2 of them, people were amazed. They didn't know what they were hearing was not just live music. A mix of live music and cutting-edge tech was played. Things got really interesting for electric guitars in 1952. Gibson is a well-known guitar company that teamed up with Les Paul, a singer and inventor who had been playing around with guitar design for years. Les had already made a prototype with a solid body, which he named the Log. That a guitar made from a single piece of wood could make a sound that was better and easier to control. But for his idea to really take off, it needed the support of a big business. That's where Gibson came in. Back then, Gibson knew they had to come up with a response to Fender's Telecaster because it was becoming more famous. They asked Les Paul to help them make a new guitar with his name on it that would compete with Fender's popular models. Les had a lot to do with the design, and it took months of work to make the first Gibson Les Paul model. Because the top was cut from maple and the body was solid mahogany, it had a warm, rich sound with a lot of sustain. Les thought a gold finish would make the guitar stand out. What they came up with was the famous gold top guitar, which looked as bold as it sounded. The first 2 models made were sent to Les Paul on May 20th, 1952. After a month, he played them live at the Paramount Theater in New York, presenting Gibson's newest work to the world. To stay at the Waldorf Astoria. It wasn't just a product launch. It was the start of something much bigger. Les Paul and his wife Mary Ford always made sure that people could see and hear the guitar when they played. Les didn't just agree with it. Every time he played, he showed how good it could be. This deal was just as groundbreaking when it came to money. Les Paul got paid fees for every guitar that was sold, and he had patent rights for some design features, like the unique wrap-over bridge. But there were some things that were wrong with the first guitar model. Ted McCarty of Gibson made the first tailpiece, which made it hard for players to bend strings easily. A few people found it annoying. Over the next few years, Gibson kept making the design better. In 1955, they replaced the original bridge with a more advanced tunematic system. It was possible for players to fine-tune their pitch thanks to this small change. The Stratocaster was lighter, cheaper, and looked more modern, even though it had a bold shape that was influenced by Les Paul. Many players thought the Les Paul was too heavy and out of date. Gibson stopped making the first single cutaway model in 1960 because sales had dropped so much. They came out with a new model called the SG that had a smaller body and 2 cutaways. The name Les Paul was still on at first, but Les didn't like the new look. By 1963, he had asked Gibson to take his name off the cover. As the original Les Paul started to fade away, something strange happened. A golden Les Paul standard was first played on stage by Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones in 1964. Some other musicians paid attention. Before long, Eric Clapton was using one to make his famous records with John Mayall and the Blues Breakers. As more blues and rock artists fell in love with the guitar's thick, powerful sound, Mike Bloomfield joined them. Gibson saw the change and made a brave choice. They brought back the original Les Paul shape in 1968. There was more to this guitar than just another one. It showed how powerful rock music was becoming. The Les Paul was a big deal in music history by the 1970s, thanks to stars like Jimmy Page, Pete Townshend, and Slash. They became some of the most expensive instruments ever made. Today, early model from the year 1958 and 1960 are now worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, making what was once thought to be a failure one of the most sought-after guitars ever. Les Paul and Mary Ford used to be a great singing pair. They worked magic together on stage. They were having trouble with their marriage off stage. They had been together since 1949, but by the early 1960s, things were very bad between them. It was 1963 when Les Paul asked for a divorce. He said she had been seeing other guys. Among them were singer Foy Willing and builder Donald Hatfield. He also said she ignored their kids and made him feel bad by talking about her relationships in public. It began as a love story with music, but it ended in sadness and scandal. Les Paul stopped singing after his divorce. It wasn't just the end of his marriage when he lost Mary Ford. He was no longer working with her on music, and something was missing without her. He also knew that the music business was changing. Rock and roll had taken over, and his music was no longer the most important thing. But instead of trying to keep up with the new acts, he focused on something he had always loved: new ideas. There was more to Les Paul than just music. He liked to come up with new ideas and was always looking for ways to make sound better. During this time, he made the pulverizer, a device that let artists use their instruments to control sounds that had already been recorded. The things he did in the studio paved the way for recording methods that have changed the way music is made today. He was changing the business in ways that most people didn't even know about when he wasn't acting. But his body was giving out on him while he was making new technology. It was hard to play guitar after all those years. He had trouble moving his fingers because of arthritis. He had hearing loss that made it hard for him to enjoy the music he loved. This would have been the end for a lot of artists. It was just another problem for Les Paul to solve. He changed the way he played to work with his limits. He learned new skills that let him keep making music in his own unique way. He was away from a stage for years, but he was never really gone. He recorded Chester and Lester in Guitar Monsters with the famous musician Chet Atkins in 1976 and 1978. The world was reminded of how smart he was by these records. He was still showing why he was one of the best musicians of all time, even though he wasn't performing all the time. Then something strange happened. Les Paul chose to play live music again in the late 1980s. He was in his 70s at this point, which is a time when most artists have stopped working. He didn't slow down, though. In 1995, he started playing every week at the Iridium Jazz Club in New York City. A lot of people came to see him play every Monday night. People from all walks of life came to see the man who changed music forever. He won one of the most prestigious music awards in 1988. He became a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, joining stars like Bob Dylan and the Beatles. The event took place in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. It wasn't forgotten. His induction was done by Jeff Beck, who was one of the best musicians of all time. Beck said something on stage that a lot of people already knew. Les Paul had taught him a lot. Paul had changed the way he played, the way he thought about the guitar, and even the skills he used. It was an act of respect that showed how important Les Paul was to a lot of people besides his music. After almost 20 years, he showed once more that his influence was real. He won 2 Grammy Awards. His record, American Made World Play by Les Paul and Friends, was more than just a bunch of songs. Artists like Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Keith Richards, and Sting worked together on it as a tribute to his memory. That night, he got 2 Grammys. One for Best Pop Instrumental Performance for Caravan, and one for Best Rock Instrumental Performance for 69 Freedom Special. I was amazed to see it. A man who changed music decades ago and won many awards, showing that his sound would never go out of style. It wasn't just music that made him famous. He was made a member of the National Inventors Hall of Fame in 2005. He was in a very small group of people who were recognized for both their artistic and technical brilliance. Everything changed because of what he did for music technology. His early model of a solid-body electric guitar, called the Log, was used as a model for current electric guitars, such as the famous Gibson Les Paul. His work with multiple tracks changed the way music was made by letting artists precisely put different sounds on top of each other. These weren't just little changes for the better business. Les Paul never stopped doing the things he loved, even in his last years. He played at New York's Iridium Jazz Club every week, using his music and telling stories to the people watching. President George W. Bush gave him the National Medal of Arts in 2007, which is another sign of how much he had done for music and society. Documentaries like Les Paul, Chasing Sound, told the story of his amazing life and how his drive and curiosity changed a whole age of music. He died on August 12, 2009, at the age of 94 after having problems with asthma. Was already recorded in time. He was praised by musicians all over the world. Slash said he was lively and full of good vibes. The Edge from U2 said that without him, rock music would not be the same. He was buried in Waukesha, Wisconsin, where he grew up. Fans still celebrate his memory there with exhibits like the Les Paul Experience. Even though he died in 2009, his impact lived on. His wealth was worth a lot of money, built on guitar income, patents that changed the world, and a collection of rare instruments. After that, there were record-setting auctions, family fights, and court cases that still have an impact on his reputation today. One of the main ways he made money was through Gibson. When the first Les Paul guitar came out in 1952, he was given $5 for every one that was sold. It may not seem like much, but if you figure out how much each guitar is worth now, that's about $60. Gibson briefly stopped making the model in the 1960s, which made things more difficult. But by the time he died, over 1 million Les Paul guitars have been sold. Old guitars from the late 1950s became some of the most expensive in history. Les Paul was rich in more ways than just guitars. A well-kept 1959 burst can now fetch over $400,000. He had ideas that changed the way music was made. New technologies let artists mix sounds in ways that have never been done before. It wasn't enough for these ideas to be popular. They were also copyrighted, which meant that businesses had to pay to use them. The exact amounts aren't known, but these rights made a lot of money for many years. He also kept some guitars for himself. He had pieces of music history in his own collection. The Log was the most well-known. The first solid-body electric guitar was based on a prototype he made in 1941. But which is the most valuable? It was his 1952 Les Paul Gold Top. It was Les Paul's first mass-produced guitar, and he played on TV all through the 1950s. It didn't live up to predictions when it finally went on the market. It was thought to sell for $100,000. It was sold for $930,000. There was more to come after that sale. In the year 2013, Christie's held the exceptional sale, an auction with over 150 things from his estate, for years after he died. And it wasn't just guitars that were sold. Handwritten lyrics, early recording gear, and experimental designs were also sold. This famous green 1959 Les Paul was one of the most talked about pieces. It was once owned by Fleetwood Mac's Peter Green and was later bought for $2 million by Kirk Hammett of Metallica. People would do anything to own a piece of history because everything had a story to tell. Not every person was glad. His son Gene was in charge of the estate, and some people didn't agree with the choices he made. A lot of people thought that old guitars like the Gold Top should have stayed in the family or been put in a museum. Gene said that the sales were okay because his dad didn't want his memory to be kept secret. Everyone should be able to see his work. There were more fights after that. There were fights over how to handle the Gibson earnings. Not everyone in the family wanted to reinvest. Some people wanted the money to be given out. In 2021, things got even more complicated when Gibson won a case against Heritage Guitars, making its trademark over the Les Paul body shape even stronger. That meant more money came in. Also, there were more fights. Then there was the fight over his recording rights. Some people wanted to actively license them so that they could make a lot of money from them. Others were against it because they thought it would hurt his image as an innovator.